Just about today's talk. So we at the Public Sector Division are delighted to bring today's talk to you. The talk, which is titled Bridges to Prosperity, is presented by Andrew O'Connell. Andrew is a chartered engineer and principal structural engineer with Fehily Timoney and Company. He's also president of the EI Temple Bar Toastmasters. Andrew was the team construction lead for the Gatar Suspended Bridge. It's just located outside Kigali in Rwanda. The project was undertaken via collaboration between Bridges to Prosperity and European engineers. The project involves construction of a 37-metre span suspended bridge built by hand over the Yanza River, with construction taking place over a 2-week period in November 2018. And just with that short introduction, I'd like to ask Andrew O'Connell to commence his presentation and tell us all about this bridge. Thank you. Andrew, you may proceed.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so welcome everybody. This bridge was constructed in 2018 at this stage, and it was done through collaboration with Bridges to Prosperity during my time at Rowan and O'Donovan Consulting Engineers in Rwanda. So whereabouts is it exactly? So there's obviously Africa right there. There's the capital, Kigali, and the bridge site is actually just located just outside of Kigali. So how did this come about? So ultimately, ROD are a member of a collection of consultants called Europe Engineers, and they had decided to send a team to collaborate with Bridges to Prosperity to do a project like this. So ultimately, what we ended up calling the industry team took a number of people from the various consultants you can see there. There was 2 from Basler Hoffman, 2 from Bureau Happold, 2 from Pondio, 2 from CTEC, 1 from Salfo, and 1 myself from ROD as well. So yeah, so that was the industry team, plus 2 guys from Bridges to Prosperity. Ultimately, 1 was a foreman and he acted as the translator as well, and then a series of locals as well, and they would be what we would loosely call the contractor. Now, as part of the industry team, a number of us had various roles, and my role was the team construction lead, which is ultimately the person charged with building the bridge, looking after all the various people on site, making sure it gets done okay. So yeah, so first challenge, a couple of us had arrived in the night before. How many engineers does it take to put tarp on the back of a Hilux? It took about 5, but in the interest of getting a record of it, I decided to step out of the rain and take a photograph of the whole thing. But yeah, all our bags are inside there. So yeah, we got suitably drenched. The bag survived it. But yeah, that was our first team challenge. What's quite interesting as well, when one does a project like this, whatever about the bridge and all of those other things, the primary questions you get are around sleeping arrangements and toilet. So up at the top left, you can see our kitchen. We had a couple of locals that prepared food for us every evening when we got back from site. In the top middle, you can see our ensuite bathroom, no running water. So one of the locals would actually fill that green bucket when we were gone every day. And depending on whether you were going toilet or going shower, it was the pink bucket. Top right, that was quite interesting. There's one of the Jeeps that we had, but ultimately one of the issues was nobody done an auto track for the little concrete ramps going in and out of the house. So that it took about 2 or 3 of us to guide people out of the Jeep in and out of the house every morning and evening. Bottom left, you can see the sitting room, and then the bottom right, you can see actually the view from our accommodation every day. Yeah, next challenge. So you can see we had just set off to site the first morning, and we came across this truck that had collapsed a tiny little culvert in the road and had gotten stuck. So you can see 2 members of our team here being helpful, and then another 2 of the guys here all being very helpful. We decided that we wouldn't really be able to help because we had to get to site. So we actually went back all the way around and took a series of local random roads to get ourselves into the main road into Kigali. But yeah, it was an interesting start anyway. So here's the site. So as you can see, the locals had tapped into a large substantial water main and were using that for their own water. You can see the level of the water in the river is obviously quite low, but during the rainy season, it got very high and effectively made this, pretty much impassable. In the background here, you can see the blue tarp. That was kind of where we had lunch every day, and just kind of behind this tree is a white building. There was a little, for want of a better phrase, a little shed where all our tools were kept, and there you can see the 2 vehicles that we had hired for the 2-week duration of the work as well. So what was it? Okay, so this is a 37-meter long suspended bridge. You can see the quaternary, and then it's obviously anchored then in quite substantial abutments. At the time, it was certainly the biggest abutments that Bridges to Prosperity had built. The implication of that is that these are built by hand, so ultimately they need to be filled by hand. Take note of the design sag and hoisting sag, critically important for the behavior of the cables. So what that means is during the installation of the cables, you needed a 1.7 meter difference from the bottom of this cable to its location here. So that was quite important. What the design sag was is once the deck is in place, that displacement should go from 1.17 meters to the 1.48 meters. So we had to keep an eye on that. Yeah, so this is site. You can see this is what we ended up coming to. So you can see a substantial amount of the abutment had already been built by a Bridges to Prosperity team with some locals. You can see all the timber for the deck here. You can see all the rocks, the sand and stone. You can see the substantial cavity in the abutment that needed to be filled upon the installation of the cables, and you can see the abutment on the other side. Keep in mind that all of this sand, rock and gravel all needed to go into this hole all by hand. Okay, so the first morning, what did we do? So we divided actually the team into 2 groups. One was the cable team. So that would be the team charged with actually setting the cables and getting the correct sag. And the second team would be the deck team. And that would be ultimately a crew of people put together, create a little assembly line to actually form the little pieces of the deck. So the deck was formed with a series of hangers, which was actually just 10 mil reinforcing, a transverse steel member, then down on top of that, a timber transverse member, and then to make the running surface, a series of longitudinal planks. So what we did is to get the locals involved. Now, this is an allocated team of locals who had been involved in the abutment, so this wouldn't have been their first time here. But we created a little assembly line where we'd a person, painting on the treatment for the steel here. Then we set out, I suppose, the long planks, cutting them up to make the transverse members. Then we had a team here pre-drilling holes in the planks. And then once it came out the other side, we had a few people actually painting on the timber treatment. And here you can see the little stack already of the drying of the timber planks. So ultimately, these 2 teams would work in parallel. So setting the cables, which is really of critical importance, is if I actually just go back up to this slide here. So the way this is built is that you have what's called a dead end and you have a live end. So in other words, cables are fished through this little anchor beam here and they're clamped together. No tension in the cables, no cables are pulled at that juncture. What you literally do then is you put the cables on your shoulders, you walk them across to the other side and you fish them through on this abutment here, and you attach a jack on this side and start pulling the cables. So dead end, live end. So here you can see the cables in the abutment, obviously no tension. You can see them fished through the ducts here that were cast into the anchor beam. And then what you do is you ultimately clamp these together. Now, we had quite a substantial socket wrench on site to help get the correct amount of tension. I think after clamp number 2, it broke. So the backup plan for that was actually to have a little vernier calipers. And there was guidance given with regard to if you squeeze this, you should have, and you reduce its cross section by this much, you should have the right amount of clamping force. So that made me particularly nervous because you never really know if this is 100% right until everybody walks across the bridge. So yeah, so these all had to be manually done with a much smaller wrench, and we needed to satisfy ourselves that they were clamping it correctly by the reduction of cross-sectional area of the cable here. So that was quite a challenge. So yeah, getting the sag on the cables, this took us about a day and a half. So to make sure that the level of 1.17 was 1.17 meters lower at the center than here, we ultimately had to set up a little level just off the site. So you can see all the little guys getting pretty keen on it. So what he would do is he would look at this and spring it across to the middle and back and over and back. And this guy here would manually pull on the cable. As you can see, a line is going up to the cable here, and it's quite literally pulling it across. This was particularly challenging. We started out in the morning when it was about 15, 16 degrees, and we were doing it all afternoon when it was about 34, 35 degrees, and the behavior of the cable was changing as the day was going and the temperature was changing. So that was quite a challenge. It took us about 6 hours to set the first cable. And lucky enough, we kind of got the measure of how to do it better then. So the remaining 3 cables were set over the next couple of hours between that evening and the following day. But yeah, Sam, the guy here, could probably run for office after the completion of the project, because all the kids were mad about him because he let them look through the level. So yeah, so this is, while we were doing the cables, you can see this is the deck team. You can see the steel transverse members here, all treated, set out and drying. You can see the crew here cutting and drilling the various members for the deck. And so you can see a team here as well, treating the timber, and you can see them all drying here in stacks. Again, you can kind of see the tool shed there, and you can see where we used to sit and eat lunch as well. So once the cables were set and locked off on both sides, it came to actually treating them and also filling up the abutments. So what we do to protect the cables, because you can't really ever see them again, is they were protected with a bitumen / tar / diesel type mix on the cable. You can see it being applied here. And then prior to the large rocks being dumped into the abutment, to protect the cables, we mix together by hand a mortar mix. So that's what's surrounding the cables there, and try to fill around them as best we can with smaller stones, so that when we were lobbing in big rocks, ultimately the cables wouldn't get damaged. Yeah, so this was quite interesting. Prior to going on the trip, when we were organizing this with Bridges to Prosperity, they'd said that one evening you're going to meet a couple of locals. And we had understand this to be something akin to Asher. We'll go down and we'll have a chat with about 10 or 15 locals and it'll be fine. So we decided to come out. We were told one evening, this is the evening you're going to meet people. And yeah, so we took off site one evening about 5:30, 6 o'clock. And yeah, there must have been at least a good couple of hundred people here, all sitting around waiting for us to arrive. I was, as you can see, I'm obviously suitably dressed and shaved for the presentation in front of so many people. And I had tactfully kind of parked myself on the row of seats behind, because I was pretty much used up all my oxygen for the day at that juncture. But the guy on the right here was our site foreman and our translator. And obviously not many, if any, spoke English, and even less spoke Limerick. So he leaned over his shoulder, and just before, just as this politician here was finishing talking, he goes, "Andrew, you wouldn't mind saying a few words?" And I was like, oh, God almighty. So what you do is you stand up, and like a crab in the bucket, you drag everybody else into it, so you can see me introducing all the members of the team to the crowd there, and hopefully coming up with something intelligent to say as he's translating what I had said previously. But yeah, that was being dropped in it a small bit one evening from site. So yeah, onto the fun part, which is filling the abutments by hand. So all of this rock had to be transported in to fill up the abutment. So you can see ultimately the team here, us trying to learn how to carry the rocks like the locals, which is put them up on top of your head. The girls were just unbelievable. They got jerry cans, they split them in half and put all these little stones in it, put it on top of their head, and there's one of the guys there putting it on her head, and that was it. It was for hours, just quite literally by hand, walking up and down the abutment. And if anybody had incurred any malfeasance up to that point, I set them as being the rock breaker. So we quite literally had a guy with a sledgehammer breaking rock for the afternoon in the middle of the heat. Once all of the rock was in the abutment, then it needed a, let's say, a reasonable running surface. So it had to have 100 mil deep of concrete that, again, all had to be mixed by hand. So once we were done filling up with all the rocks, we had to go off and set about mixing a couple of meters of concrete. So up in the top right here, we'd set up what I lovingly became called the pit. So that was everybody just simply mixing concrete. So if anybody was on good behavior, they were given the job of actually walking the concrete up the bridge. But everybody else was ultimately stuck inside in the pit, mixing concrete. And it took us, there was quite a lot to mix, especially when you can't use a concrete lorry. So just have a quick video here. You should be able to hear the sound of actually what the concrete pit was like. Yeah, so as you can see, once the concrete was ready, it was put into the split into jerry cans, quite literally picked up and walk up the abutment, put it into place and go again. So that was hard work, and it's very hard to demonstrate in the photographs the heat. It was certainly in excess of 30 degrees. So this is generally what lunchtime looked like, which was people kind of taking a break and taking time out. And like any self-respecting Irishman, I destroyed a couple of t-shirts on the trip over there. But this is definitely my favorite photograph. He just went off and fell asleep one afternoon. It was particularly funny. But yeah, the heat was definitely a factor with all the manual labor. So yeah, once that abutment was done, it was actually time to start putting up all of the prefabricated deck pieces. So you can see that's me there, one of the guys. You put on the steel transverse piece, you put on the timber transverse piece, you fish the cable through the piece of reinforcing. And then to ensure that this piece was the correct height, we'd cut let's say a piece of timber to length. What you do is you ultimately then, obviously the safety harness and so forth, but you actually form the piece here, but leave it loose enough so that actually you can push the pieces of deck out in front. So you end up with this little train effect going all the way across the bridge. So I've just got a little video of that here. Okay, so about halfway through, let's say at the end of the first week, we were making quite a bit of progress and we decided to go see Rwanda. So we decided, thankfully, Rwanda isn't the biggest country in Africa by far. So we decided to go down and see Lake Kivu. In the background, you can't really see it in the photograph, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And was quite interesting where we had our accommodation. We'd no internet and stuff like that. But if we stood at reception at this accommodation, we could actually get a small bit of internet to see what was going on in the world. And by some quirk of fate, when I looked at BBC, their main headline was largest outbreak of Ebola in years at Lake Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I subsequently just turned the internet back off again and didn't tell my mother. But I decided to rehydrate with two of the guys. You can see that up in the top right. A couple decided to go off and do cultural things. At that point, I had no interest in doing anything cultural. But yeah, three of us decided to rehydrate for the afternoon, which was great fun looking out over the lake. The next afternoon, on our way back to site, we decided to go up to Masanza, where the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund is. So this is, if you're ever going to see the gorillas out of the Congo, right? Well, you wouldn't be crossing into Congo. But if you want to go up into the jungle, this is where you'd be going. So we decided to visit that. And what you see in the bottom left is how many engineers does it take to fix a Toyota Hilux engine. We surmised that it was ultimately Dirty Diesel, but you can see the guy here in the blue top calling his friend who was a mechanic in Greece so he could listen to the sound of the engine to see if he could figure out what was going on. But yeah, we surmised it was Dirty Diesel, and we eventually got it back to site, thankfully. So, start of the second week, it was, I suppose, ultimately complete the deck, and people started getting really excited at this juncture because it really started to look like a bridge. You can see everybody involved, all harnessed up. You can see all the spacing of the various deck members. And you can see the team there ultimately putting down the longitudinal planks all staggered, and you can see them bolted down onto the deck. So a lot of the locals started to get, excited at that point because it actually really start looking like a bridge. But the reward for completing the deck was going back into the pit because the other abutment then had to be filled up, the live end. So all of this rock had to be broken up and put back into the abutment. You can see here the pit part 2, everybody getting stuck into mixing the concrete. And you can see we had a little assembly line going on once all the rock was in to ultimately fill in the little concrete, running surface, which is 100 mil deep. You can see us just very quickly, rushingly putting tarp down on top of it because we got the downpour one afternoon. But yeah, kind of coming toward the end of the construction now. You can see it's kind of putting chicken wire here, just ultimately for the bridge deck. So that was going on while the remainder of the team were in the pit, mixing concrete. And a couple of timber lats here then to act as like little steps and a little opening there for motorbikes. So this is because the slope as you get to the abutment is quite steep. This is kind of act like little pseudo steps. Yeah, so then this is us just pulling the cables for ultimately the guardrail coming off the back of the bridge. And then like any self-respecting bridge engineer, we got our little by-band shot with the bridge as we came to the end of it. Yeah, and there's the final bridge. We painted the top of the towers there in the Rwandan flag, but that's ultimately all the site cleared. Yeah, so really it was all about these guys here. These were a couple of locals drafted in. These were 2 masons. They were absolutely brilliant. And I mean, when we were flagging in the heat, their just ability to keep going. There's the girls, the guns, the jerry cans, and obviously we tried to do this, putting the jerry can or even rocks in our head without using our hands, and all failed miserably. But their ability to just keep going relentlessly, especially with the abutments in the heat, was just fantastic. Just a quick one on this. At the time, I was on the executive committee of Engineers Without Borders in Ireland. So we had done a collection to bring to the local school, like loads of like pencils, set squares, all of those things. That bag is chocked full of stuff. People in ROD donated and everything, and we brought over footballs and everything. So we took some time out one afternoon to go to a local school to drop off all of that stuff as well. Yeah, and this is what it's really all about, these little guys here. Now, as much as sites are controlled over here, on the site on our side is, despite us cordoning it off, obviously they wouldn't take any notice. And we had to walk over and back on this little bridge as we were building ours. So these guys were brilliant, great time. They were just so curious, so spontaneous, and like even the simplest thing like they could play with, it was just so rewarding when you were doing it. You could see it was for these little guys here that we were doing it for, Yeah, so as we were finishing out the bridge, one of the guys had an idea to all of the locals that were involved and our team to actually etch our names on the side of one of the abutments. So that's what the team are doing there. Yeah, so we knew okay, so as we come towards the end, this is the opening ceremony. We kind of really underestimated how much was going to be involved in this. So we kind of helped set this up, and this is the day of the opening of the bridge, but it's about 3 hours beforehand. So I just got a couple of videos here of kind of the crack that was going on. Yeah, so that was about 3 hours before the opening. And this is kind of just before the opening ceremony formally kicked off. Note the guy in the blue top and this lady here in the green grey top still giving it loads. A great degree of excitement, and obviously with something like that, obviously we all get dragged out into it. So you can see the entirety of our team and a couple of local dignitaries in this video here. Yeah, so great excitement. I mean, just at this point, when you're, I suppose, so interested in, getting the job done and everything that was going on and all of that, a guy actually gave a speech at the opening, one of the locals. And we didn't know this before we started, but there was actually, prior to starting the bridge, there was a lady who was about 8.5 months pregnant, and she was trying to cross the river during rainy season. And typically what they said is they typically put a child up in an adult's back and they might make it, but that actually wasn't an option. And she never made it to hospital. But if the bridge was there, she would have. Now, thankfully, she was all right. But you could see the guy was actually getting quite emotional, and it kind of hit us because we had spent so much time, concentrating on getting everything done. But it kind of really hit home the real life impact that projects like this can have on people. So yeah, so there's the bridge on the day of opening, subject to a nice torsional load tests there, everybody looking on one side, and there she is standing. And this is a video actually of the opening. I don't know if you'll be able to see, but I'm way out in front, kind of looking back, kind of going, God, I hope the clamps are working. So just play this here.
Laurie! Laurie!
Adrian!
Hey, Adrian! No, he's up back.
Adrian!
Wait.
Yeah, so you can see me just standing there at the end looking back on, God, hope it holds up. And I'd say we might have almost reached the 5 kilonewton per meter squared as well. Yeah, so this is the last slide. So ultimately, from an ongoing maintenance perspective, obviously we had the locals involved, and as part of building it, we'd be teaching the locals about how we're actually building the bridge and so forth. So here's a photograph with me with all the locals who we designated as the future maintenance team. So you can see in their hand here, like a maintenance manual for the bridge and how to replace deck members, how to ultimately replace various items on the bridge. So they would have been all involved from start to finish, and you can see them there with their little certificates as well, from Bridges to Prosperity. So that's it, guys. That's it from me.